The most famous pilot who ever lived was forbidden to fight for his own country, and the order came from the White House itself. So he took a job at an aircraft company, put on a uniform with the insignia stripped off it, flew halfway across the Pacific, and went into combat anyway, as a civilian, in an airplane somebody else had drawn. Every American alive knows his name. Almost nobody knows the name of the man whose airplane he was flying, and that man is the reason you're here today. His name was Rex Beisel. Before we dive in, subscribe and tell me in one sentence where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment. He was born in 1893, and he grew up in Cumberland, Washington, a small mining town tucked into the foothills of the Cascades. His father worked the mines. There was no money for anything, least of all a university, so Rex went into that mine himself and hauled his education out of it one shift at a time, driving the mules, working the coal, saving every dollar until the University of Washington had to let him in. He came out in 1916 with a degree in mechanical engineering and a pair of hands that had already done 20 years of work. Then he sat a civil service examination, and he scored so high that the United States Navy hired him on the spot. In 1917, he started as a draftsman at $4 a day. Naval aviation itself was 6 years old. There were almost no textbooks because nobody had written them yet. Nobody had done the thing long enough to have anything to say about it. So he taught himself in the dark, the way he had taught himself everything. And by November of 1919, he was one of a small handful of certified aeronautical engineers in the entire country. 2 years after that, at a drafting board in Washington, he drew an airplane called the TS-1. It was the first fighter the United States Navy ever had that was built to its own specifications. The first airplane in American history designed from the first line to fly off the deck of a ship. In December of 1922, it came aboard the USS Langley, and American naval aviation, as you know it, began. Sit with that for a second. Every catapult shot you have ever seen, every arrested landing, every carrier deck in every film you ever loved as a boy. All of it starts with a drawing made by a miner's son who had been in the business for 4 years and had never once been told he was allowed to. He left the Navy for Curtiss after that, and 2 years later, at the Pulitzer Air Races, the closest thing that decade had to a Super Bowl, with grandstands full and the whole country reading the results over breakfast, airplanes of his design came in first and second, both of them his. And if you had gone down onto that field afterwards and asked the crowd who had drawn the winner, not one hand would have gone up. It is the first time this happens to Rex Beisel. It will not be the last. 9 years later, he walked into a company in Connecticut that was quietly dying. Vought built float planes, slow, honest, unremarkable things. Their only production fighter was a biplane on floats that could manage 120 miles an hour on a good day, and the two fighters they had tried to follow it with the Navy had simply refused. Chance Vought himself, the man whose name was on the building, had died the year before. The place had a name and not much else. Rex Beisel arrived in 1931, and everything that company would ever be famous for happened after he walked through that door. He gave them the Vindicator, the first monoplane scout bomber the Navy ever had. He gave them the Kingfisher, and if your father or your grandfather ever went into the water in the Pacific and watched a little float plane come skimming across the swell to pick him up, that was a Kingfisher, and this is the man who drew it. In 1934, he won 2 medals, one of them named for the Wright brothers, for a technical paper about something almost comically unglamorous: how to wrap a cowling around a radial engine and keep it cool. Hold on to that. It matters in 4 years. In 1938, the Navy came asking for a new carrier fighter, and Beisel did something that looks like arrogance from a distance and looks like faith up close. He went and got the biggest engine anyone on Earth had ever built. The Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, nearly 2,000 horsepower, the largest aero engine ever bolted to a single-engine fighter, and here was a man who had spent his career learning exactly how to cool a radial engine, now strapping the largest one in existence to the smallest airframe he could get away with. But power like that is useless unless you can get it into the air. And to turn all of it, you need a propeller 13 feet and 4 inches across. Put that on a normal fighter, and the blade tips carve the runway. Make the landing gear long enough to clear it, and the legs snap the first time you drop onto a moving deck. He was stuck. And so, at a drafting board in Stratford, Connecticut, he took the wings and he bent them, down at the root, up at the tips, because it was the only shape in the world that let that propeller live and still let the airplane come home to a ship. That is the whole secret of the most recognizable silhouette in American aviation. It wasn't a dream. It was a man solving a problem he couldn't get around. And that is worth remembering the next time you see one. The most beautiful fighter America ever built got its shape from a problem, not from a vision. On the 29th of May, 1940, at a municipal airport in Bridgeport, a test pilot named Lyman Bullard opened the throttle, and Rex Beisel's idea came off the ground. 6 weeks later, it very nearly ended forever. Vought's other test pilot was a 26-year-old named Boone Guyton, and on the 11th of July, the weather was marginal, and he went up anyway, because that is what test pilots did in 1940. Somewhere over Norwich, Connecticut, he ran out of options. There was one Corsair on planet Earth, and it was underneath him, and below that there was a golf course. He put it down on the 14th fairway. It rolled about 250 feet, caught a tree, tore a wing apart, and went over onto its back in a wooded gully full of rock. Boone Guyton climbed out with scratches. The next morning, the local paper gave the whole thing a few hundred words on an inside page, a small item about a low-wing metal job that had come down on the golf course. No names of consequence, nothing to see. That was the entire public record of the day. America almost lost the Corsair before anyone had heard of it. Guyton would climb into that airplane again and again for years, and eventually he wrote a book about all of it. He called it Whistling Death, and that October, the airplane he'd nearly buried on a golf course became the first American fighter in history to break 400 miles per hour in level flight. And then his own Navy said, "No, understand what that sentence costs." This is a man who had given the United States Navy 20 years. He drew the first fighter they ever owned. He was the reason a fighter could land on a ship at all. And the Navy looked at the fastest airplane in America, his airplane, and told him it could not land on their carriers. The nose was too long. On the approach, the pilot lost sight of the deck at exactly the moment he needed it most. The landing gear bounced. One wing let go before the other one did. So they took the Corsair away from the carriers and gave it to the Marines, who flew it off islands instead. And in February of 1943, it went into combat over the Solomons from a strip of coral. And this is the strange mercy in it. The Marines did not care. They didn't have carriers to worry about. They had mud, heat, coral, and Japanese fighters that had been humiliating Americans for a year. And somebody had just handed them the fastest thing in the sky and told them nobody else wanted it. They took it and they loved it. Rejects usually know each other. Somewhere in Connecticut, a quiet man in a suit read those reports. He never said much about how that felt. He wasn't the kind of man who did. But here is the thing that tells you what his airplane really was, and it happened while the Navy was still refusing to put it on a ship. On the 18th of April, 1942, the United States Navy walked into an aircraft factory in New York and simply took it, seized it, plant, management, board, everything, and put a naval officer in charge of the whole operation. The White House gave one sentence of explanation: dissatisfaction with the management. The Navy gave one more: the existing private control has not proved adequate. And the single job they handed that seized factory was to build Rex Beisel's fighter. Read those two sentences again, because that is what a country does when it wants something badly enough. It wanted his airplane. It just didn't want to say his name. Now come back to the man from the beginning. After Pearl Harbor, Charles Lindbergh asked to be put back in uniform, and he was refused by order of the White House. Think about the strangeness of that. The most famous aviator who has ever lived, the man whose name your grandparents learned before they could read, and his own government would not let him near the war. So he went to work, first for Ford, and then for the Vought aircraft division of United Aircraft Corporation, the division Rex Beisel was running. In April of 1944, Lindbergh flew out to the Pacific as a civilian technical representative for the Corsair, and almost nobody in Washington knew he had gone. His own wartime journal has him on the 15th of April flying from Palm Springs to Mojave, straight out of a meeting at Vought, in a Corsair the company had assigned to him personally. On the 22nd of May, he flew his first combat mission, escorting torpedo bombers to Rabaul with the Marine Corsair squadron, and he did not stop there. He flew dozens of combat missions in the Pacific as a civilian. He taught young pilots how to lean their engines until the range on Beisel's fighter stretched further than anyone at the factory had ever drawn it. He worked out how to hang a 2,000-pound bomb under the belly of a Corsair, the heaviest load a fighter had ever carried anywhere, and then he went and dropped it. And that same year, 1943, Rex Beisel was made general manager of the whole division. So while the most celebrated pilot on Earth was out over the Pacific stretching his airplane past its own blueprints, the man who drew it was sitting behind a desk in Connecticut running the company that had sent him there. They never fought over it. There is no feud, no falling out, no story. Just two men, quietly good at the only thing they had ever wanted to do. So stop and look at these two standing next to each other, because this is the whole story, and it will only take you 10 seconds to feel it. Same company, same airplane. One of them got a Pulitzer Prize, a film with Jimmy Stewart in it, and a permanent place in every history book printed in the English language, so famous that a president personally had to keep him out of a war. And he went anyway. The other one drew the airplane the first one couldn't stay away from. And if you had stopped 100 Americans on any street in the country in 1944 and asked them who Rex Beisel was, you'd have gotten 100 blank faces. You still would today. History remembers the man in the cockpit. It almost never asks who drew the seat he's sitting in. The Corsair came home in the end. And it came home the way most good things do, because somebody else was stubborn about it. The Royal Navy is widely credited with working out the answer. Not a redesign, just a long, slow, curving turn onto the deck, so the pilot keeps the ship in the corner of his eye the whole way down, instead of losing it behind that enormous nose. Vought raised the pilot's seat 8 inches and threw away the caged canopy for a clear bubble, and suddenly a man could see what he was doing. By the spring of 1944, the United States Navy cleared Rex Beisel's fighter for carrier operations. The airplane they had thrown off their own ships came back to them, and it stayed. And it would not stop. It flew through Korea in a sky full of jets, and the only American naval ace of that entire war didn't fly a jet. He flew a Corsair. One of them even brought down a MiG. 12,571 of them were built, and no American piston engine fighter was ever in production longer. But the ending is the part I need you to hear, and I promise you have never heard it. On the 17th of July, 1969, 24 years after the war it was built for, the year Americans watched a man walk on the moon, a Honduran pilot named Fernando Soto took off in a Corsair. He shot down 3 aircraft that day, 1 Mustang, and 2 Corsairs, it was the last time in the history of the world that propeller-driven fighters fought each other in the sky, and there has never been another one since. Both sides were flying Rex Beisel's airplane, and the very first machine to fall out of the sky that day was a Mustang, Edgar Schmood's airplane. 2 men, 2 names nobody has ever heard, 2 quiet engineers who drew lines on paper in the 1940s and never got a film, never got a statue, never got so much as a street. And the last time propeller fighters ever fought each other on this earth, it was their 2 machines still going, a quarter of a century after everyone who built them had gone home. Rex Beisel was 75 years old that day, alive, in a house in Sarasota, Florida. Whether he ever read about it, no one wrote down. Nobody thought to ask him. That is the thing about a man nobody knows. When the last chapter of his life's work finally happens, there is no reporter on the doorstep, no camera on the lawn, just an old man somewhere warm, and a newspaper, and a story on an inside page about a small war in Central America. He died 2.5 years later, on the 26th of January, 1972. He was 78. Look at what sits between those 2 dates. In 1921, he drew the first fighter America ever built for its Navy, a biplane, 200 horsepower, landing on the deck of the Langley in 1922. In 1969, the age of the propeller fighter ended in the sky over Central America, and it ended with his airplane shooting down his airplane. 48 years. The whole era. Every carrier deck, every Pacific island, every man who ever came home because that shape came over the trees, opens and closes inside one man's career. And the last airplane he ever oversaw at Vought was a swept-wing jet with afterburners, the first the Navy ever had. He drew the biplane that landed on America's first carrier, and he signed off on the jet. Nobody else in the history of American aviation did that. Nobody. That Honduran Corsair still exists. It sits in a museum in Tegucigalpa, Honduran, the last one in the country, the last airplane that ever shot down a propeller fighter, parked quietly where hardly anybody goes. And here's the part that isn't history at all. Corsairs still fly. Somewhere this summer, at a field near you, one of them is going to come over the trees with that engine loose and rumbling, and those wings bent down the way one tired man bent them in Connecticut because a propeller wouldn't fit. Children will point, old men will stop talking, and nobody standing on that grass will say the name of the man who made it, because they've never been told it. So when it happens, when that shape comes over and everything in you goes quiet, turn to the person beside you and tell them, Rex Beisel, son of a man who worked the mines, paid for his education with a mule and a shovel, drew the first fighter America ever put on a ship, and the last one that ever won a dogfight. Charles Lindbergh flew his airplane and made it better, and the world remembers Lindbergh, and it forgot him completely. Fame is a lottery. Some men win it for crossing an ocean. Some men earn it every single day of their lives and never get handed the ticket.